Welcome. Thank you for coming to our May installment of the Curatorial Shorts, a series of talks highlighting research, new acquisitions, and scholarship happening in Columbia's Rare Book and Manuscript Library. This week, we have with us Emily Runde, who will be speaking about a new manuscript addition to the RBML collections. Emily is the curator of medieval and Renaissance collections, as well as an associate member of the classics department at Columbia. This past spring, she co-taught a course on Latin paleography. And her talk today is titled, "Let It Be Like an Orderly Paradise, a book of rules to live by in a Renaissance convent." I would also like to invite you to put on your calendars next month's talk by Karen Green, our curator for comics and cartoons, which will be on June 14th at 4 p.m. And throughout the talk today, feel free to put your questions in the chat, and Emily can speak to some of those after her presentation. Without further ado, over to you, Emily.
Thanks. Let me just share my screen. Is that visible?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. So first of all, my thanks to my colleagues Vanessa Lee, Emily Sasso, and Kevin Schlottman for their work making these curatorial shorts possible. And my particular thanks to Lena Mo for organizing them. And thanks to you all for being here today. As Lena mentioned, today I'd like to introduce a recent addition to Columbia's collections that I'm quite excited about. I'll be discussing some of the reasons why I find this Renaissance manuscript so exciting. And at the same time, I hope to shed some light on some of the considerations that inform acquiring new additions to a collection rooted in many centuries past. One significant consideration here was this manuscript's research value. So my goal today is not to share any in-depth research into the book, so much as to highlight opportunities for such research to be done now that the manuscript has found a home at Columbia. So what are we looking at here? It's a small book fitting easily in the hand and slim as well. By the time this book was written in 1511, paper was not difficult to come by in Europe, particularly in Italy, where this manuscript was made. But this volume has been made with pages of parchment, not paper. And though it has been carefully prepared, we can still see hair follicles here, particularly in the close-up, enduring traces of its animal nature. It has been written with evident care and skill in a very legible script. Even if medieval and Renaissance manuscripts aren't your bag, I imagine you can probably decipher many of these letter forms and even words, due both to the care taken by the scribe and the fact that many of these particular script letter forms exert an enduring influence on typography from the earliest days of print in Europe to our Times New Roman. A similar care has gone into the book's decoration, much of which serves the practical purpose of dividing the text into identifiable sections and subsections and guiding the reader's eye to particularly useful information like chapter headings, which are highlighted here in a very eye-catching bright red script. The decoration of the book's opening page goes significantly beyond such practical considerations, though, with golden bars and leafy borders adding purely aesthetic splendor to the page. People expended time, effort, and money to make this book. It was a book of some significance to them. At the same time, if we look through the volume, it's not pristine. Even this lavishly decorated opening page shows considerable signs of wear, as you can see here. Some of this comes down to the book's movements and travails over the 600 years since it was made, and much of that we have not yet reconstructed. But one thing that excites me about this book is that I think some of this comes down to the book's use as well. Not all medieval and Renaissance manuscripts show any sign of use at all. Our beautiful Phoenix Hours, for example, was clearly a luxury object, more so than a devotional one, even though it is a prayer book. No one recorded their family's births, deaths, and marriages in its opening leaves or its margins, or even necessarily handled the pages with any regularity, something that we can deduce from the very white and pristine nature of the margins here. and here as well. They are very clean. The pages of this book, on the other hand, show signs of handling. Look at the lower right corner here, where many hands have grasped the page to turn it. And here are a few more examples of what I'm talking about. I'm sure you can kind of see that smudgy area in the lower right corner here. Not only that, but where the text has been worn away or possibly effaced, we see instances of its careful restoration in a different, less sure hand. And that's particularly visible in the detailed image here on the right side, where someone has gone back and written words over. People cared about what was in this book enough to read it and to maintain it. And what's in this book, of course, is a set of rules governing the conduct and practices of a community of nuns in Genoa. We know which community because the writer of the manuscript identifies the community and himself in a colophon, which I'm blowing up here. In translation, this is the book of the canonesses regular of the Lateran congregation of St. Augustine, abiding in Genoa in the Abbey of Sant'Andrea della Porta, written by Father Gregorio da Piacenza, then chiefly their confessor, 1511. This is not a book containing the capital R rule of St. Augustine, which contains the precepts for the order laid out by its putative founder, Augustine of Hippo. Rather, this is a book that explicitly frames itself as a supplement to that very short rule. It is a collection of specific prescriptions to guide the daily conduct of the nuns and the functioning of their community so that they might stay in line with the broader strokes of their rule. What's more, it is unpublished and unedited, and as of now, I cannot say whether any other copies of this text exist. And this, of course, adds to this book's interest and value now. Father Gregorio copied this book for this particular community, a community with whom he interacted as the priest who would have heard the women's confessions. This book prescribes the conduct of this community, their liturgical practices, their mode of governance, what they wore, how they ate, where they slept. And it outlines the penance or punishments for a variety of anticipated infractions the nuns might commit. And these range from the relatively minor, so for example, receiving and keeping a gift without the knowledge of the abbess, inviting outsiders into the monastery to eat, which has a special resonance for us all now, I think, after a year of lockdown. Not going to sleep promptly, that kind of thing. On the other hand, on the more severe end, we have penances or punishments stipulated for gravely injuring or killing a fellow nun, or fleeing the convent, or conspiring to overthrow the abbess. Reading between the lines, it is possible to suss out the lived realities that this text aimed to cultivate and to temper. And you remember how Father Gregorio dated the book's production to 1511? That's quite significant as well. The monastery of Sant'Andrea della Porta, the ruins of whose cloister you can see here, had a long history in Genoa, going back to at least 1109, when it was documented as a house for Benedictine nuns. For centuries, it attracted women from the city's most illustrious families and amassed lands and buildings. The house remained in Benedictine hands until 1510, when it transitioned from a Benedictine to an Augustinian convent. This was part of a wider reform movement known as the Observant Reform that had been sweeping through many religious orders in Europe since the 15th century. The Lateran congregation of St. Augustine, to which our nuns belonged, was constituted in the 15th century as an observant congregation within the Augustinian order. As the name implies, observants sought a return to a stricter observance of their foundational rules and of the constitutions of their orders. And their movement got a lot of buy-in from 15th century popes like Eugenius IV and Nicholas V, who saw the installation of observant monks and nuns in religious houses as a means of centralizing their power as well as renewing discipline. At minimum, this manuscript would have been an instrument for imposing a stricter discipline within the walls of Sant'Andrea, having been produced for the community precisely at the time that it was making its own transition to observant reform. It would have been an instrument as well for solidifying a newly established or transformed religious community. Which brings us back to the matter of who was reading this book, a major factor in what attracted me to this particular manuscript. This was a book written for the women of Sant'Andrea. This is why Father Gregorio, though clearly able to write in Latin, that was the language of the colophon, has not only written this book in Italian, but has written it in the local dialect. In a monastic context, you're far more likely to find the vernacular being used for women than for men, since their literacy in their vernaculars was far more of a sure thing. As a text in Italian, this book could be consulted more readily by nuns of the community. And it seems likely that it would have been consulted. Consider its prescriptions for teaching novices during their year of probation. Novices had to be fully versed in the customs and values of this house and of the order before they made their profession and became nuns. The nun tasked with teaching the novices would have relied upon the contents of this book, among other things, to ensure that the novices were prepared. What's more, the text is quite interested in the matter of the community's literacy. And this is something I hope somebody takes a closer look at some point, because it's all over the book. The book statutes make repeated reference to the benefits of a sister reading aloud while the community engages in daily work or meals. Prescriptions for praying of the divine office anticipate a sufficient number of literate sisters to chant the office at the canonical hours, while making provisions for the non-literate sisters and how they ought to pray during these regular communal liturgies. And parenthetically, I'll just say one wonders if these provisions might point to a diversity of class backgrounds in the community, and perhaps specifically might apply to the conversae, who would have been members of the community from poorer backgrounds who would have engaged in domestic service, essentially, in the convent. Stepping back. So this is a book written by a man to be read by a community of women living in an enclosed monastery, largely walled off from the outside world, at least in theory. In its provisions for these women's lives within this space, we can discern plenty of patriarchal anxiety over regulating these women's bodies and speech. I'm sure that comes as no surprise to any of you. And it's worth noting that the specter of the wayward nun was often invoked at this time as a pretext for the state to exercise greater control over resources under ecclesiastical jurisdiction. Less than 50 years earlier, Genoese lawmakers had called out the, quote, petulance, audacity, and impudence of local nuns. But these statutes are also quite interested in how to maintain order and keep the peace within a community in which women are largely responsible for governing themselves on a day-to-day basis, making community decisions by casting of votes, electing their own leadership, and enforcing a judicial system that is largely self-contained. This aspect of the book strikes me as particularly interesting for a variety of audiences. I would think this community's approach to restitutional justice, for example, might hold a lot of interest for people working outside the study of the European Renaissance, say to contemporary thinking about the governance or policing of school or university communities. Returning to Sant'Andrea in the 16th century, it's worth remembering that the community had just gone through a huge transition in which they might have been negotiating the blending of formerly Benedictine nuns of Sant'Andrea with newly arrived observant sisters, which would have been a rather fraught situation, one suspects, or even a wholesale transplant of an observant community to this venerable monastery. Further examination of these statutes and further historical research could shed considerable light on the particular dynamics at play in this community at the time that these statutes were written up for them. But in the meantime, we do have another piece of evidence ready at hand to consider alongside the text of these statutes, and that's this book's opening illustrations. In addition to the purely aesthetic adornments of burnished gold and painted acanthus leaves, this decorated page features 3 illustrative panels that speak to the nature and values of the community.